When the species of humanity first entered the Galactic Federation, excitement and trepidation were the prevailing emotions for everyone watching. A new species was a somewhat rare event, as many of the sapient species that come close to reaching FTL or other such astral navigation techniques kill themselves off before they make it. As such, a new species entering the community meant that a new wealth of technology and insights could be gained from the newest species wise enough to decide they would prefer to live. However, as humanity's envoys flew in on boxy and frail starships that lacked a hint of psionic infusion, much of that trepidation was lost and replaced with confusion. As it turned out, humanity was almost completely devoid of any of the psionic potential that every other species contained. As such, had not developed a speck of technology in the branch of psionics, and even had an entirely mundane version of FTL, unfamiliar to the community. Admittedly, humanity's material science was rather well advanced, as it rivaled even the most technologically dedicated species. However, it is generally understood that psionics are simply more efficient. One could create a fusion generator to power their ship and ion thrusters to move it. However, a psionic engine and star cell are far more energy efficient, as well as less volatile. The one thing that material science could do better than psionics was reliability, which meant that they were only reserved for auxiliary and support roles for the most cautious of captains. This put humanity at a disadvantage in terms of advancement and industry, which was a shame as they had no influence on the matter. Regardless, humanity was welcomed into the community with open arms, and many species opened relations with the burgeoning species, who were determined to do what they could despite their inherent handicap. And so they expanded into the galaxy, colonizing new worlds with the occasional bit of help from their neighbors, and generally living their lives. The humans turned out to be a pleasure to be around, as their optimistic view of the world rubbed off on everyone. Curious humans joined the Galactic Federation in the research of all fields, including psionics, and their innovative minds threw out suggestions to problems they only had theoretical knowledge over. These talented humans then took back the knowledge that they had accumulated and advanced their species' technology and industry rapidly until they were on par with the rest of the Federation. As the Federation learned more about them, it was eventually discovered that the humans did actually have some latent psionic potential in the form of a sixth sense. It was seen that the humans of the past referred to it as their gut feelings, and research into expanding humanity's abilities were beginning to take root. It was beginning to look like humanity had the potential to utilize those abilities and join the rest of the community in psionics. That was until they came. From the edges of known space and the intergalactic void, eldritch monstrosities began to make themselves known, as they almost swam through the great blackness of space towards the little section of the galaxy that the Galactic Federation had been established. Those who initially discovered the monsters dubbed them the Devouring Swarm, as they recorded the complete consumption of a thankfully uninhabited life-bearing planet on the fringes of space. Scouts and scanners predicted that they would hit the closest inhabited system within the year, at the earliest. With news of the incoming threat, armadas were formed and expanded, as armies marshalled and trained, all the while humanity aided the effort where they could, while quality converting their factories. As the last preparations were finished, the many fleets and armies jumped to the first inhabited system that was in the path of the eldritch monsters. With the path of the swarm a known variable, the planet had been nearly entirely evacuated, leaving the world nearly uninhabited, aside from the local fauna and the few uncooperative locals. As the Federation armies made the planetfall and began setting up the planet for a defensive campaign, the Armada began splintering into a wide picket formation around the system. As they moved out, humanity petitioned to join them. However, the newly formed Galactic War Council decided that they would prove more of a hindrance than an aid once contact was initiated, and thus only approved the humans to act as supporting vessels. It was decided that the humans' psionicless fleet would act as the rearguard, evacuating wounded and non-combatants, and resupplying the main fleets when needed. And with that, Time had run out, and the devouring swarm from behind the galactic veil were upon them all. Their hulking behemoths of the abyss eclipsed the stars, as thousands of smaller parasitic ships swarmed out from them before they were met with psionic lance and detonation. Ships danced and dodged with the grace and fitness of masters, as psionic beams cut through swirls of the massive tentacles and claws that made up the eldritch fleets. All was going well for the first few hours of the engagement, and it would have continued to do so, if one of the three largest abominations that had a psychic whale, which washed through the armada in its entirety. Those ships closest to the Goliaths spontaneously lost all psionic energy, cutting off their propulsion and weapons in totality. They were butchered like animals. Those fortunate to be farther from the blast suffered heavy reductions in psionic power, leading to partial system failure, leaving those lucky ships to only be hobbled but not crippled. As for all the ships caught in between those two extremes, it quickly devolved into chaos as the eldritch fleets descended upon their wounded prey. As the carnage ensued and the combined fleets of the Galactic Federation were torn apart piecemeal, the 30-odd human ships delegated to the back line began beelining it towards the battle, as fast as their iron thrusters could push them. By the time that the humans arrived into the battle with their kinetic core guns and missile tubes, the psionic shockwave had dissipated. However, the damage had already been done. Hundreds of the best ships the races of the galaxy could muster had already been consumed, and those left were well on their way to succumbing to the swarm. The commanders in charge of the combined armada screamed at the humans over their communication links to fall back, to warn the council, but were only met with silence as the human contingent dove into the fray. Metal slugs and nuclear detonations quite literally exploded out from the human ships as they tore through the offending monstrosities, giving those Federation ships who had survived the onslaught a chance to escape the carnage. As much as the initial shock of humanity's attack managed to do in terms of beating back the hordes of eldritch monsters, such success was short-lived, as the motivated but outnumbered human ships were taken out one by one. Soon there was only one cruiser left, firing out of the dozens of sister ships that had initially charged with her. However, the humans did not break nor falter in their duty, as the final ship rushed forward towards one of the eldritch Goliaths and played the last card afforded to the crew. As the light of the ship's self-destructing reactor shone on the retreating forces of the broken Federation armada, a psionic screech sounded out as one of the largest of the eldritch ships died. The death seemed to reverberate across the horde, as many of the smaller ships closest to the dying Goliath spasmed violently before expiring, leaving the Federation fleet the chance to flee, far from what would be deemed the first battle for the Argonaf system. Coalescing back at the closest inhabited planet, which had quickly become garrisoned and fortified by the many armies of the Federation, the ragged fleet sent back news of their defeat to the Council, and the terrifying weapon used by the devouring swarm of the Void to cripple them. Soon enough, the fleets got a returning message stating that they were to fall back to the nearest industrial world for repairs, and leave the ground forces to hold the line until reinforcements could be mustered. This was a grim decision that many of the still surviving fleet commanders objected to, as it would practically doom those left to defend the world. However, the reality was that they were in no state to argue, as the armada was down to 60% of its original strength. Additionally, more than 80% of those ships were suffering from major hull breaches and needed repairs desperately. And so, with a heavy heart, the fleet departed. And with that, the ground forces left on Argonaf Prime were on their own. With the knowledge that they only had so much time before the swarm would be upon them, the ground commanders quickly set about preparing the world for a planetary siege. Psionic shields were set up, along with the more conventional shield generators of humanity, around the 5 major cities. Both mundane and psionic gun emplacements were constructed and manned. Troop deployments were arranged, and fallback points were prepared. At the insistence of the human commander, humanity's forces were positioned at the most vital of strategic points, with the knowledge that if the worst came, and all psionic equipment would be disabled, those points would still have an effective garrison. And so the great hordes from beyond the veil approached. Soon, Their hulking mass hung over the planet, and thousands upon millions of their number descended down upon the planet. Anti-air batteries and psionic cannons fired up into the sky, as atmospheric fighters of both varieties performed dogfights with their eldritch counterparts. The swarms of monsters crashed against the various shields constructed around each of the major cities in the world, all of which were quickly chipped and cracked before they shattered under the weight of the slain corpses. And then it was the infantry's time to shine, as psionic pulse weapons and kinetic slug throwers held back the tires of chitinous claws and razor-sharp teeth of the swarm. The first wave was repulsed with only minor casualties, as the armies of the Federation held the line against the hordes of monstrosities. Bullets and psionic pulses coalesced into a torrent of death, as the eldritch abominations were cut down in the tens of thousands. The second wave was where things began to have problems, as larger variants of the eldritch swarmlings began appearing, and they seemed to possess a toned-down version of the psionic whale, which left the Federation's weapons simply ineffective against the larger variants, and a horde of swarmlings around them. This wave tore through the planet, and the less numerous human soldiers were unable to handle every incident, and thus nearly all of the outlying settlements and minor towns were abandoned, in favor of fortifying the core cities. Here, the humans could more reasonably react to the new swarmling forms. It was quickly determined that these new, larger, synapse swarmlings were a major threat given their psionic nullifying abilities, and as such counter-tactics were conceived. Soon, the human forces were splintered, with human snipers and sharpshooters being stationed all across the battlefield, taking out the larger synapse swarmlings to give their fellow troopers a chance. That is not to say that there were no times where the front line broke and ran, or were crushed by the onslaught of the swarm. No. Hundreds of soldiers, both alien and human alike, broke and ran at the sight of the hordes. However, thousands more stood firm, and held the line against the devouring swarm. Nevertheless, this battle of attrition was not a sustainable one. Slowly but surely, Federation allied forces were being pushed back, one step after the other. Additionally, supplies were only so plentiful after all the logistic ships were forced to retreat when the Eldritch fleet entered orbit. The first city to fall was the coastal city of Aratari, as thousands of swarmlings charged out from the fields, while higher forms sprung out of the water to wreak havoc on the back lines of the Federation garrison. Thankfully, for a system of underground train tunnels that linked the capital city of Emperorthel to the coastal city, most of the personnel and remaining civilians were able to make it out, before the last of the automated defenses failed. Unfortunately, the majority of the equipment stored in the city was lost with it, but regardless, the survivors made it through the tunnels unimpeded, before manually collapsing their escape route once everyone was clear. The second city to fall was the aerodrome city of Wembeck Peaks, as hordes of flight-capable swarmlings filled the skies with their bodies, while thousands of ground-based eldritch monsters charged up the mountain. Wembeck Peaks was the premier aerospace base, as it possessed hundreds of hangars and repair fields, and in tandem with its already high altitude, Allied fighter and bomber craft were able to easily repair and resupply after combat. Its loss would have crippled the United Federation's aerial capabilities, and it was seen that the swarms knew it. Close-range carpet bombing and strafing runs from the aircraft station there were run near constantly as the siege continued. Hundreds of thousands of the swarmlings were torn apart and burned to a crisp under the roaring heat of a plasma torpedo. It was looking favourably for the defending garrison, as the anti-air batteries and interceptor runs were able to keep the flying swarmlings at bay, which meant that their enemy needed to crawl up miles of mountain before reaching the front lines. Unfortunately for the garrisons defending the city, tunnelers burrowed into mountains that the city was built on, and began swarming into the defences. The worst of the casualties were avoided with a quick reaction force that took out the tunnelers, but there was now a gap in the defences that the swarm would be sure to exploit. And with that, the garrison was forced to retreat via air transport. Some soldiers decided to stay behind, and manually control some of the anti-air batteries in order to give those transports a fighting chance, and making it to the Emperorthel. However, even with their sacrificial effort, more than a fourth of the transports were brought down before they reached their destination. Those who volunteered were killed to the last trooper, as swarmlings flooded through the freshly dug tunnels and overwhelmed the deserted city. The last city to fall was the industrial city of Urenthal, and it took quite a while for it to do so. Having the advantage of being built on a thick and dense patch of bedrock, the city was more or less immune to the tunnelers that Wembeck Peaks had succumbed from. Additionally, the many factories and forges had been handed over to the Human Engineering Corps, who spent a considerable amount of time converting their production capabilities from psionic equipment and consumer goods into making good old-fashioned bullets and rifles. This gave the city a near unparalleled strategic value, and there was a reason why 2/5 of the human soldiers stationed on the planet were deployed there. As the swarm descended down upon the city, they were quickly met with torrents of rifle fire from the human and Federation soldiers, equipped with the freshly made weapons. This, unfortunately, garnered some rather unwanted attention from the eldritch monstrosities, as the bulk of the abominations seemed to be drawn to the city like moths to a flame. Thousands upon thousands of the swarmlings rushed across the hilly terrain, all the while being peppered with bullets from the defending soldiers and blown apart by artillery. It was here that the worst of the fighting took place, as higher forms of swarmlings became commonplace, and new, more deadly variants showed themselves. Stalkers, tankers, acid spitters. If you could come up with it in a nightmare, it was there, and killing someone. The garrison held out as long as they could, but it was a losing battle. By the time that Wembeck Peaks fell, and the bombing runs with it, the city of Urenthal was down to half of their original number. Eventually, when it was decided that the city was doomed, the remaining soldiers gathered all that they could reasonably carry, stuffed it all into the few remaining ground vehicles that had survived the last couple months of combat, and made a desperate attempt to flee back to the last 2 surviving cities. The trek was a dangerous one, as they had to fight through swarm-controlled territory to reach the closest defensive emplacement. However, given that the other option was to face total annihilation, the troopers decided to roll the dice. They made it. Mostly. By the time that they arrived back into friendly territory, a full third of their vehicles had been destroyed, and the remaining ones were in rough shape. But they had made it, and with them were enough weapons to arm most of the remaining soldiers that made up the garrisons of the 2 remaining cities, Emprethel and Cariep. Now, Emprethel, managing to hold on, was fairly reasonable, given that nearly all of the reinforcements had been recovering there after each of the cities fell. But how did Cariep survive? Well, it's simple. While technically considered 2 different cities, Cariep and Emprethel were built so close together that they were practically part of the same city, and thus the 2 had a well-connected logistics network, allowing for the garrisons to mutually support each other. It also does not hurt that the city of Cariep was home to the largest in-city agrarian district on the planet, and thus made it one of the most vital cities in the event of a planetary siege. As the last of the soldiers from Urenthal settled in, and the weapons that they brought were distributed, the garrisons of the twin cities braced for the final assault and prepared themselves to either hold the line or die trying. However, that assault never came, as up in orbit of the planet, the second battle for the Argonaf system started with a bang. 30 magnetically accelerated cannon rounds slammed into one of the 2 remaining juggernaut-sized monstrosities, each with the energy required to level a small city. Humanity and the Galactic Federation had not been idle while their armies fought and died for Argonaf Prime. Ever since news of the eldritch monstrosities hit human territories, industry once spent producing the many consumer goods that humanity exported were hastily converted into military factories. All across human space, the first frigates and cruisers were flying off the orbital shipyards and surface dry docks, while battleships and carriers were being brought online before the first psionic lance was fired. The half-year of early warning, and the 3 months brought by the hundreds of thousands who died in the ground campaign, was just enough time for 10 dozen ships, filled with humanity's best, to be marshalled in time. Following behind the vessels of humanity was the recovered Federation fleet, which had spent the 3 months reconsolidating their number and retrofitting their systems. While not as effective as human designs, the vastly more numerous Federation fleet was able to be brought up to fighting shape, equipped with mundane weapons and armor, as well as experimental psionic weapons that had been designed to resist the whales. Together, they burned forward and collapsed upon the unexpected abominations in a blaze of untempered fury. Magnetic railguns cycled firing sequences, as carrier cruisers and battleships discharged brave or crazy human pilots. As the Eldritch fleet sluggishly reared their fangs and prepared to charge forth, human torpedo frigates dove into the fray, spewing their nuclear payloads into the heart of the Eldritch formations. Federation vessels lit up the void with laser and plasma as they danced across the stars with a faint hum of ion engines filling their ears, and a raging fire in their hearts. The wounded Eldritch Goliaths screeched and wailed their death cry as a lucky shot from a Federation battleship hit something vital, and for the second time the swarm stuttered and stopped, as if overwhelmed by the death of their mothership. Core gun rounds and laser beams streaked across the void and ripped apart the disoriented swarming ships as the final Goliath ship began to drift back in a desperate attempt to avoid the fate of their sister ship. A second barrage of railgun shots to what the Galactic Community research team deduced was the propulsion system of the monstrosity was enough to stop that. Bloodthirsty Federation ships and still eager human frigates and cruisers all dove upon the wounded Eldritch abomination like a school of piranhas as it was torn apart, one shell or plasma lance at a time. When all was said and done, the Eldritch monstrosities had been slain. The Galactic Community had won. In the years that followed, humanity had fully restored their industrial base back to civilian production, while still keeping a significant portion to keep the expanded expeditionary fleet running at tip-top shape. Occasionally, another hive of abominations would drift out of the warp, along with their Goliath of a hive ship. However, permanently standing guard over the system of Argonaf, the combined Sentinel Armada stands watch, prepared to face and fight them at every step of the way. And in the hulls of every ship in that fleet is a human reactor, burning hot and readily, waiting for the opportunity to vent its fury on those who attack its galaxy.